All right, hey guys, it is Miss Getz, and I'm going to do your notes on carbohydrates. So in your note packet, your carbon note packet, you should be flipped to the first kind of very large table. It takes up the entire page, and it says at the top, the same thing it says at the top of my screen right now, biomolecule number 1, carbohydrates. So remember, there are 6 elements of life: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, and we use those to build the kind of 4 molecules that all organisms use to build their bodies. And the first one that we are going to talk about are carbohydrates. So we would call them carbs. You guys have all heard of carbs before, but you might not know why we need them in our diet, what they're used for, and why they're important for us in a biological sense, which is what we're going to get into a little bit today. So if you don't have a pencil, grab your note packet, and grab a highlighter. I'm going to have you highlight a couple things that are really important. So when we talk about carbs, out of our 6 elements of life, we need to know what makes them up. So you have a spot for this on your table. So carbs are made of, first and foremost, carbon, which, again, all organisms are made of carbon. We are carbon-based life forms. We also are going to have some hydrogen and then some oxygen. So these 3 things, when these 3 atoms bond together, we could be making a carb. We could be making some other things, but we can assume that it may be a carb if I see lots of C's, H's, and O's when I look at a molecule. And specifically, they're going to bond together in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So if you don't know what ratios are, they are a way to compare things. So what this means, in the molecule, for every 1 carbon atom I have, I will also have 1 oxygen atom, but I will have 2 hydrogen atoms. So it would be like the kind of common one we use is glucose, C6H12O6. So I'd have 6 carbon atoms, 6 oxygen atoms, that's 1 to 1, and then 12 hydrogen atoms, which is the 2 and the 2 to 1, so I have double the amount of hydrogen atoms. So if you counted them really quick, you would always have equal carbons and equal oxygens, but you would have double the amount of hydrogens. And it kind of looks like this. So this is glucose. So if you counted them really quick, you should see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons. If I counted all the oxygens, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. I missed that one. So 6 oxygens, and then your hydrogens, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And this is kind of the general structure that you'll see them in. As scientists, we like to show what the molecules actually look like. So this is called a ring structure. So it's a ring shape. So it's a general shape for like pentagons, hexagons that we would see in science. And when you see that shape and you see carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, you need to think sugar, carbohydrates. That's really important. So other names, right under the elements block in your table, you have a spot for other names. The other names are sugars or starches. This is what we would call them if we were just talking about it to another person in a non-science class. You would just say, like, hey, this has a lot of sugar, these potatoes are really starchy. You wouldn't generally say, these have lots of carbs, or these have lots of glucose or amylose or something like that. So we would use sugar or starch. So carbohydrates are a kind of class of molecules, and we get to build polymers. We talked about that the other day in class. So when we build polymers, big molecules, we need monomers. So remember, the monomer is the building block or a subunit of something larger, like the tiles, the individual tiles in a larger floor. Each of them is a piece of the larger structure that help build that structure. If you're missing a piece, then the larger structure is incomplete. And the monomer of carbs is this kind of really weird long word, monosaccharides. Mono means 1, saccharide means sugar. And I would like you to highlight this in your notes. I will ask you what the building block or the monomer of carbs are. And this is what you need to be able to tell me. You need to be able to tell me monosaccharide. And just some examples of a monosaccharide. You're not going to need to memorize these, but just some examples. Glucose, which is one we will use very often. which, again, that beautiful ring shape right here. You have carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. Fructose, that's going to be a fruit sugar. So when you eat fruit and it tastes sweet, that's what you're tasting. And galactose, which helps make the sugar that you would find in milk, which is lactose. But galactose is part of that. So notice that they all end in ose, O-S-E. So ose, ose, and ose. They all end in that. Most carbs will, most single sugars will. And that's going to indicate to you that it is a carbohydrate. So that's what we call a naming convention. So remember, these are monomers. These are pieces, like little Legos that we use to build something larger. So we're trying to build polymers. And polymers is anything larger than a monomer. So we can, when we link two monosaccharides together, we can make a disaccharide, the prefix di meaning two. So make sure you're filling this in on your table. So two monosaccharides joined together is a disaccharide. And just some examples. Again, you won't have to memorize this, but when I link glucose and fructose, which are two monosaccharides, I make sucrose. That's table sugar. So when you have sugar at your house, it's going to be sucrose. And that's what it looks like. So the sugars don't look exactly identical. Glucose looks a little bit different than fructose, but we do dehydration synthesis to put them together. So remember, whenever we link two monomers together, we do dehydration synthesis. Another example is maltose, which is glucose and glucose. And here is what maltose looks like. And these two are identical because they are both glucose. So again, you don't need to memorize disaccharides. Just know they are two monosaccharides linked together. And then if we get larger than that, we just call it a polysaccharide. So there's no such thing as a trisaccharide. Once you go beyond two, it's going to be a poly. Poly means many. So many, many, many monosaccharides joined together. And this could be like hundreds of monosaccharides joined together in a row. And some examples that you will need to know. So glycogen stores excess sugar in animals. This is you. So you store excess sugar in the form of glycogen. You store it in your liver. And it is there if you need it right in the morning. You haven't eaten in a while. You start burning that kind of first before you start burning anything else. Starch is how plants store excess sugar. These you would find starch in things like potatoes and carrots. So plants don't store fat, but if they make a lot of sugar, which they're making through photosynthesis, then they need to store it for later, for when maybe there's not enough light or not enough water. They still need sugar or energy. So starch is how they do that. And we as humans have just kind of found that these things are good to eat. So think like potatoes, carrots, and things like that. Pasta, lots of starch in pasta. And then another one, cellulose, makes plant cell walls rigid. So when you eat something like celery and it's very crunchy, it has no nutritional value for you. You can't get anything out of it, but it helps the plant grow upright because plants don't have skeletons. So they have these little walls around their cells that give them a little more strength and support and structure. And here's just what these things look like. Just to show you, each little piece of gray, that is one single sugar, that's one monosaccharide. So in starch, you have a long kind of chain in the middle and then some branching off of that. So it's a branched structure, like we talked about, that carbon can form many different kinds of structures. Glycogen looks very similar to starch, a little bit more branching. And then cellulose is, remember, cellulose is very strong. So it's kind of set up in this wall shape, which is funny because it makes cell walls, but it's very, very strong. So we have lots of bonds linking it all together. All right, so our next thing is, are carbohydrates soluble in water? Meaning, do they dissolve in water? And this tells us, are carbohydrates like polar, or are they non-polar? Because remember, water dissolves polar things, but not non-polar things. So simple sugars like glucose. So glucose is soluble in water because they have certain areas that are polar. So they have areas on them that have polarity, so they can interact with water. You've seen this before if you put sugar in tea or coffee or sugar in water. You know that it dissolves. So it's because it does have areas that are polar. All right, and functions. This is what you are going to need to highlight. So you do need to know functions of carbohydrates. First one, most important, we need carbs for quick energy. So sugar provides quick energy for cells. It's easy for them to break down and actually harness the energy out of them, which is why if you're kind of feeling a little bit sluggish and you eat a little bit of candy, you perk up really quickly because your cells get a quick and easy burst of food to break down very quickly into energy. Cell walls in plants, we already talked about, helps them grow really tall. So support and structure in plants. So here is a picture of plant cells, which we will look at under the microscope in a couple of weeks, maybe even less than that. These dark structures right here, like all of these, the dark structures are a little more fibrous, but right in here, all of these little boxes, around all of these boxes are cell walls. And that's what's helping them to grow tall because, again, they don't have skeletons. Exoskeletons of insects and some animals like crabs or lobsters. So if you look at an insect, it's hard. It has like its skeleton, exo meaning outside. Its skeleton's on the outside. They don't have a skeleton like ours on the inside. So the exoskeletons actually made of carbs. And they're very hard carbs. So when you crack open a crab, right, if you've ever eaten crabs or lobsters and you have to kind of crack open the shells to get the meat on the inside, it's very difficult sometimes to do that because the exoskeletons are very strong. Things like cockroaches, beetles, and other insects also have exoskeletons. So, and here's actually a beautiful one, but all this on the outside right here, it's a harder structure. That is, that's their skeleton. That's what that's their protection. And that's why they need to shed. So you'll find like cicada shells, or there's a season where you get soft-shelled crab, because in order to grow, they need to shed their whole exoskeleton in order to kind of grow, because it kind of holds that shape. It's not very flexible. So they need to get rid of it in order to grow a little bit, and then they'll regrow a new exoskeleton. And here's a little crab. Okay, food examples. You guys know carbs, so breads, pasta, potatoes, candy, beans, like anything that's good and delicious. Anything in this picture, really. So carbs can be sweets, or they don't have to be sweet. It just depends on how they're kind of put together. But we have lots of fruits, we have pasta, we have oats and grains, potatoes, all of that stuff. So again, you should have highlighted your monomer. What's the monomer? You should have highlighted the functions in organisms and the elements. Go ahead and highlight the elements at the very top that make them up and the ratio. Those things are going to be really important.